So we are now winding down the very last days of the month of Rajab, and one of the differences of opinion amongst the Ummah that we find predominant is the 27th of Rajab, and the issue of Isra al-Mi'raj taking place on the 27th, and whether one should do some special, ibadat or dhikr or siyam, or coming together and discussing the incident of Isra al-Mi'raj, or whether these types of issues are to be avoided. So that is one discussion. I have spoken about this in other lectures of mine. Today actually, I'm the type of person I like to, I'm very interested in the realities of how things happened. So I'm interested in where did the notion come that 27th of Rajab is Isra al-Mi'raj, and how authentic is this date? And do we have other opinions as well? Because the fact of the matter is that the earliest books of Seerah don't mention this date. So where did this date come from? And what is the more probable or realistic date of Isra al-Mi'raj if it has other dates than this one? And so once we get to the initial question, when did Isra happen, then we can get to the secondary question, should we do anything on that day? That's actually a secondary question. The initial question, Isra al-Mi'raj, which is of course, nobody denies Isra al-Mi'raj, we all believe it happened. Anybody who denies it, denying the Quran. Surah Al-Isra itself mentions, Subhanalladhi asra bi'abdihi, right? And I recited Surah An-Najm, and in Surah An-Najm, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that لَقَدْ رَأَى مِنْ آيَاتِ رَبِّهِ الْكُبْرَى. He saw Allah's major miracles. And Allah mentions فَكَانَ قَابَ قَوْسَيْنِ أَوْ أَدْنَى. And Allah mentions that He went to Sidrat al-Muntaha. So all of this is explicit. 2 places in the Quran, Allah references Isra and Mi'raj. Or to be more precise, Isra is referenced in Surah Al-Isra and Mi'raj is referenced in Surah An-Najm, right? So that's to be more precise. So everybody agrees it happened. The issue is, when did it happen? So when you go back to the earliest and the most authoritative book of the Seerah, which book is that? Everybody should know. Please tell me. Sirat ibn Hisham, right? And when did Sirat ibn Hisham, what is it based on? Everybody should know this too. Ibn Ishaq. When did Ibn Ishaq die? Because let's get academic, let's get real, scientific. Let's find out who is saying what. When did Ibn Ishaq die? What year? I'll tell you, 150. So Ibn Hisham, we don't have Ibn Ishaq's book. It was written too early. We have Ibn Hisham's summary. So Ibn Hisham, even though he died 240, Ibn Hisham is basically taking Ibn Ishaq, who is 150 Hijrah. Okay, let's open up Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq, very strangely, does not have any date of Isra al-Mi'raj, not a single date. He actually usually has dates for incidents. He's very good in this. When it comes to Isra al-Mi'raj, he does not have any date. It just mentions the chapter of Isra al-Mi'raj. However, very interesting, where he puts this chapter indicates a rough idea. He puts this chapter before the deaths of Abu Talib and Khadija radiyallahu anha. And this is not in accordance with how many people later on assume the Isra takes place after the death of Abu Talib and Khadija. In the Seerah of Ibn Ishaq, he places Isra al-Mi'raj a few chapters before the death of Abu Talib and Khadija, and then the beginnings of the discussion of Hijrah that happens afterwards. So Isra al-Mi'raj, according to this chronology, happened maybe 4 years, 5 years before the migration. He doesn't have a date. No month, no day, no year. Okay? Now, recently in the last 5 years, amazingly, we discovered not 1, not 2, well, the last 10 years, 3 very early books of Seerah. And these are now printed. When I did my long series of Seerah, these 3 books had not been printed. I didn't have access to them. So literally in the last few years, 3 very early books of Seerah have been discovered. Each one is only 1 manuscript, edited and printed. The first of them is the Maghazi of Musa ibn Uqba, who died 141, earlier than Ibn Hisham. We discovered a partial manuscript. It is printed. You can buy it in Arabic, Maghazi of Musa ibn Uqba. The second of them is just as important, the Seerah of Ma'mar ibn Rashid, who died 153 Hijrah. And the third of them is the Seerah of Sulaiman ibn Tarkhan, who died 143 Hijrah. So 3 books, all written roughly 140, 150 Hijrah. Excellent. You look up, you open, you find, lo and behold, each one of these three does not even mention Isra and Mi'raj. And the reason being, these are all treatises. They're not like big volumes, right? Each one is like, a book of this nature, even smaller, some of them. And the goal was just to preserve a skeletal outline, to mention some incidents. And for whatever reason, all three of them, they just did not mention Isra and Mi'raj at all. So we don't have any new information from these new discovered books. However, when you look at other early books of history, you find other dates. So, of the earliest books of Islamic history is the book of Ibn Sa'd. Ibn Sa'd wrote a book called The Generations. The chronological generations is called Tabaqat. By Tabaqat, he means the first generation of Sahaba, and then the sons of the Sahaba, and then the Tabi'un, and then the Tabi'un. That's what he means by Tabaqat, right? Tabaqa after Tabaqa. So he has Kitab al-Tabaqat. And this book, it begins with the Seerah. But the most of the book is about later people. But it begins with an entire volume about the Seerah. And he is 230 Hijrah. So Ibn Sa'd, in his Tabaqat, he mentions two opinions about when Isra and Mi'raj took place. The first of them, he said, the 17th of Ramadan, not Rajab, the 17th of Ramadan, 18 months before the Hijrah. So a year and a half before the Hijrah, the Ramadan before the Hijrah takes place is when Isra and Mi'raj took place. And he then mentions, and some have said, and he mentions who says this, so both of these opinions, he mentions an earlier authority. The second opinion he mentions is the 17th of Rabi' al-Awwal, 1 year before the Hijrah. Because the Hijrah takes place in Rabi' al-Awwal, right? So 1 year before the Hijrah, and the second opinion, 1.5 years before the Hijrah. Neither of them mentions which month? Rajab. No, there's no mention of Rajab. So Ibn Sa'd mentions Ramadan and Rabi' al-Awwal, a year and a half or a year before the Hijrah. The first reference I have found, and again, I have done a partial research. Obviously, if somebody finds more, please benefit us, because in the end of the day, research is never ending. I might have missed something out there. The first reference I have found about the month of Rajab, but without any number, is from another source, which is not considered to be the most reliable. It is a book of tafsir. And it is written by a scholar who has negative reviews along with some positives, but mainly negative. The reason being, this person was more known to be a storyteller than an academic. Pause here, footnote. In early Islam and in our times, the concept has always remained. You had categories of preachers. You had preachers who were very interested in authenticity, in making sure what they say is accurate, correct, referenced. And then you have preachers who want publicity. And when they want publicity, what generates publicity? Stories, drama. I mean, if I point out YouTube and what happens there, who has the most popularity in YouTube? Is it shuyukh and scholars, or is it other categories of people, right? And the same goes. So you have another category of people. They were called storytellers, qussas. They weren't the ulama like Abu Hanifa, Bukhari. No. These were storytellers. And our person here, his name is Muqatil ibn Sulaiman. He was more known to be a storyteller than an academic. And in his book, which is a tafsir, it's not a book of seerah, he has that the Isra and Mi'raj took place in the Rajab of the year before the Hijrah. The Rajab, he doesn't say 27, simply has in Rajab 1 year before the Hijrah. This is the earliest reference I have found of the month of Rajab. Now, none of these, by the way, he does not mention any authority. At least Ibn Sa'd mentioned people ahead of him. Ibn Sa'd mentions authorities 2 generations before him. None of these authorities ever mentioned is a companion. No companion authentically has given us a date or a month or a year. The earliest we have is around 150, 200 Hijrah. Scholars of those generations are presuming or attempting to extract when did Isra wal Mi'raj occur. And all of these reports suggest a timeline of a year and a half to a year before the Hijrah. Now, when I gave my Seerah lectures back in Memphis, that's what I had followed Ibn Ishaq, and I just went on with it. But even when I gave those lectures, my mind had a cognitive dissonance. There was a contradiction, and I didn't know what to do. But I said, what can I do? I just quoted Ibn Ishaq, and I moved on. There was a problem that I had, but I didn't verbalize it back then. And that problem is there is an internal inconsistency with the time frame. There is a massive internal contradiction. And that internal contradiction goes back to Surah An-Najm, which I recited right now. Now, what is the internal contradiction? Understand this point. There are two references to Isra and Mi'raj in the Quran. We said this, right? Surah Al-Isra and Surah An-Najm, correct? Both of these surahs reference what happened, correct? Look at Surah Najm, which we recited, right? Allah Azza wa Jal literally says He reached Sidrat al-Muntaha. Allah literally says فَكَانَ قَابَ قَوْسَيْنِ أَوْدْنَا. Allah literally says لَقَدْ رَأَى مِنْ آيَاتِ رَبِّهِ الْكُبْرَى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says مَا كَذَبَ الْفُؤَادُ. He's not telling a lie. He speaks the truth. He saw some major signs. So Allah Azza wa Jal is reinforcing. The Prophet ﷺ was blessed with Mi'raj. He saw these things and he is speaking the truth. Now, this means Surah An-Najm is referencing Isra and Mi'raj. When was Surah An-Najm revealed? We know from the Seerah, we know from Sahih Bukhari's hadith, from an eyewitness. Ibn Abbas is an eyewitness and others are eyewitnesses. And this hadith is in Bukhari, which is highest level. The report goes that when Allah reveals Surah An-Najm, the Prophet ﷺ recited the whole surah. Like I recited right now, the whole surah. He recited the whole surah in front of the Quraysh while he was in front of the Kaaba. This is an iconic episode in the seerah. In fact, Ibn Mas'ud said this is the first time the Prophet ﷺ did tilawah of a surah in front of all of the Quraysh. This is a historic, monumental incident in the seerah, where in the voice of the Prophet ﷺ and all of the sanadid of Quraysh, means the VIPs of the Quraysh, the leaders of the Quraysh, the nobility of the Quraysh, all of the nobility of the Quraysh. And where is this? In Mecca, in front of the Kaaba. Can you imagine this scene? Subhanallah. What an amazing scene to imagine. And by the way, Surah An-Najm is a powerful surah. Go listen to any beautiful qari. Go listen to a qari as the crescendo of the surah builds up. As the ayat build up, as the momentum builds up, and then the very ending of it, literally there's a whole series of rhetorical questions about describing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, challenging the people who reject Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then at the end of the surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says what? فَاسْجُدُوا لِلَّهِ وَعْبُدُوا. So then you had better do sajda to Allah and worship Allah. So hadith in Sahih Bukhari, and the Ibn Abbas is seeing this and others are seeing this. They say, the eyewitnesses tell us, when the Prophet finished reciting the surah, he immediately fell into sajda in front of the Kaaba. And everybody was so moved, they all fell into sajda behind him. Even the kuffar of Quraysh. Can you imagine the moment? And if you go read the translation, and if you understand the power and the beauty and the eloquence and the balagha of this surah, one of the most powerful surahs in the Quran, Surah An-Najm, right? And when he recited it, Allah says, it's a sajda. We all have to do sajda. I did sajda right now. He fell into sajda because he has to do sajda. All of the Quraysh fell into sajda. Ibn Abbas says, except for one of the elderly evil people, when he saw everybody else, he was arrogant. He picked up some pebbles and he put it to his head and he goes, this is enough for me, you guys do sajda. He mocked it basically. So one person didn't. But Abu Jahl, all of the Abu Lahab, they all did sajda. Abu Sufyan, they all did sajda. Now, what happened as a result of this? News spread. And when news spreads, it becomes from this to this. News spread that the Quraysh have now accepted Islam. And where did this news reach? Habasha, Abyssinia. And because of this rumor, The Muslims who had migrated to Abyssinia, what did they do? They came back. Now, so you understand the chronology here, right? You understand what's happening. Surah Najm has been revealed. Surah Najm references Isra al-Mi'raj. The Quraysh do sajda after Surah An-Najm. The rumor spreads all the way to Habasha that, the Quraysh are all praying Jama'ah, with the Prophet ﷺ. They're all Muslims now. And the Muslims of Habasha are not, they're living a difficult life financially, socio-economic. Can you imagine going to a foreign land and they don't speak the language and the weather and the cuisine and the people and they are strangers and everything. So when this rumor reaches them, they're like, Alhamdulillah, pack our bags, let's go back. And we all know this, every book of Sirah mentions this. They came back only to discover it was a rumor. However, it caused good because what happened was that the Muslims of Mecca heard, okay, the cuisine might be, I'm making this up, the cuisine might be bland, I'm making this up, the weather might be bad, but at least we're not being killed. So instead of 15 people, 112 people migrated to Abyssinia. Right? So Allah Azza wa Jal has His way of doing things. That when those people came back, everybody heard, we can worship freely. Khalas, let's all go to Abyssinia. Right? Now, question. When did this incident happen? Because this incident will demarcate what? When Surah Najm comes down. And Surah Najm demarcates what? Isra al-Mi'raj. You guys following this, right? Is everybody understanding this, right? We're being academic, we're being very precise, scientific, we're trying to understand when did Isra happen. And pretty much almost all the early historians mention that Surah An-Najm came down, and I have here exactly straight from Al-Waqidi, who is one of the earliest historians. Al-Waqidi says, وَكَانُوا قَدْ خَرَجُوا فِي رَجَبْ سَنَةَ خَمْسٍ. They left Mecca in the month of Rajab, meaning the Muslims left Mecca in the month of Rajab. فَأَقَامُوا in Habasha, they stayed in Habasha, Sha'ban and Ramadan. And then in the month of Ramadan, Surah An-Najm was recited in front of the Kaaba. And so they came back to Mecca in the month of Shawwal, في سنة خمس من الدعوة. Five, not Hijrah, but 5 of the preaching. The 5th year of the preaching. Here we have explicit evidence. And by the way, even if Waqidi doesn't have an earlier authority, everything fits from other understandings. For sure, the Muslims of Abyssinia did not return 1 year before the Hijrah. For sure, the Muslims of Abyssinia came somewhat middle of the da'wah, right? So, there seems to be an indication that Isra al-Mi'raj actually took place not 1 year before the Hijrah, but around 5 years into the Meccan da'wah. Now, this solves the problem, but is there any evidence for it? And this is where, again, after I gave my Sirah lectures, so I did a lot more. I'm always doing research. There is no end to research. We're all minor students of knowledge. Nobody should ever say, I have solved the problem. You always learn and study. And I've been doing research even on the Sirah. To this day, I do research as well. And so I came across some new things that I hadn't had access to back then. And of those things is that one of the things that we find is that there is a famous scholar who was Andalusian. He had access to knowledge in Andalus. He had traveled around the world and he died in Egypt. His name is Ibn Sayyidun Nas. Now he dies much later on, 734 Hijrah. And he writes a book of history. Now, in that book, he references earlier books that we no longer have. And unfortunately, he references a fact from a book where he doesn't quote us the long chain, and we don't have that book anymore. What is the fact that is so interesting? He narrates that Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri, pause here, who is az-Zuhri? Az-Zuhri is one of the most iconic figures in early Islam, one of the great scholars of early Islam, and he dies when? 124 Hijrah. Az-Zuhri, they even say he saw maybe some of the younger Sahaba like Anas, and definitely he studied with the major Tabi'un. Az-Zuhri, according to Ibn Sayyidun Nas, says, and listen to this, كان الإسراء, Isra took place في سنة خمس, in the 5th year of the preaching of Islam. Explicit from Az-Zuhri. Now, unfortunately, the reference that Ibn Sayyidun Nas uses, we don't have that reference anymore. Because we have a lot of early books that are missing here. But we have an attribution to Az-Zuhri, that it was in the 5th year. And I also found another qarina, or a supporting evidence, and that is in a very early book as well, written by one of the scholars of hadith. His name is Ibn Abi Shayba. He is like of the generation of the teachers of Imam al-Bukhari. Ibn Abi Shayba has written many books of hadith. He's written the Musannaf. He dies 235 Hijrah. So he's the generation before Bukhari. And he has a book called Kitab al-Maghazi, book of Sirah, right? Now listen to this. In this book, Kitab al-Maghazi, which we have now, I have it now and we have it in print, he doesn't have a date of Isra al-Mi'raj, but he places Isra al-Mi'raj even before the conversion of Umar. In his Sirah, in his Maghazi, he has the beginning of the da'wah. He has the persecution that the Quraysh did. He has 1 or 2 other chapters. Then he has the chapter of Isra al-Mi'raj. And then he moves on to like the conversion of Umar and other stories. And then he moves on to the beginnings of the Hijrah and whatnot. So in his book, the Isra al-Mi'raj incident takes place once again around 5th, 6th year, because that's before the conversion of Umar radiallahu anhu. So we have another evidence that another early scholar put Isra al-Miraj much earlier on. And I also have another small, very small, minor qarina, if you like, any supporting proof. And again, all of this is, listen, it's not a big deal if I'm right or wrong. Somebody says, how dare you have that? It's no big deal. It's just a date about Isra al-Mi'raj. I mean, we can calm down and have different opinions. And I'm giving my evidence. If you don't like it, no big deal. But these are all minor evidences here, or some of them are pretty clear. Zuhri is explicit. One evidence that again also not just troubled me, it troubled many ulama of the past. And that's why they had to form an interesting opinion. And that the issue is, what else happened in Isra al-Mi'raj that affects all of us to this day? Salah. Salah. By unanimous consensus, the 5 daily salawat was solidified when? Isra al-Mi'raj. Now, this represents a small ishkal. What's that ishkal? There are numerous references in the Meccan surahs to salah. And these surahs were revealed way before, 1 year before the Hijrah. And this has led some people to surmise, this is an opinion, nobody of the Sahaba told us, it's just they try to say that, oh, before Isra, Salah was obligatory but generically. We didn't know how, we didn't have time frame. And after Isra, Salah was obligated the way that we now know. Now, okay, that is an opinion. But if we were to make Isra much earlier and make it basically, because when did the da'wah start being preached publicly? The 3rd year. When did Islam start being preached publicly? The 3rd year. And that's when persecution began, 4th year. The Muslims migrated 5th year to Abyssinia. If we were to say 2 years after beginning the preaching, that is when Allah legislated Salah, it would actually solve a lot of other problems. And even from now this is a very weak evidence, I know, it's a very weak evidence, but still, it just doesn't make sense to me and to many other people that the salah would be delayed so long when we know it is so central to Islam. We know how important salah is. We all know this. It's a defining characteristic of Iman. And to claim that for 10.5 years there was no salah, it makes a lot more sense to bring Isra back according to all these other evidences and say, yes, salah also was legislated in the 5th year. Everybody had to start praying then. So in reality, to claim that Isra and Miraj takes place. Now, what is the other evidence? So the other evidence, like I already told you, Ibn Sa'd has these reports and others, and there's a psychological evidence that is used. That psychological evidence, I also used it when I gave my Seerah lectures back in Memphis. I said the same thing, and that is Isra and Mi'raj took place when the Prophet most needed it. After 3 tragedies. Number 1, the death of Abu Talib. Number 2, the death of Khadija. And number 3, Ta'if. And so Isra was a boost to his psyche and iman. And that's a nice point, but first you have to prove that it happened at that time frame. If it didn't happen at that time frame, you cannot use this as an evidence. You get my point here. If we know it happened, then we can say, yes, these are three wisdoms. But we cannot use it as an evidence to establish the date. You understand my point here, right? So just because it sounds nice that it happened at this time frame, it doesn't mean it actually happened at this time frame. So the reality, wallahu ta'ala alam, and again, this is just an opinion, it really makes a lot more sense that Isra wal Mi'raj took place much earlier on. In fact, in the 5th year of the preaching of Islam. And the fact that some people say Khadija was not mentioned, okay, she wasn't mentioned in Isra and Mi'raj, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean she was there, doesn't mean she was not there. It's just, okay, she was not mentioned. There's many other incidents of the early Islam where Khadija was alive and she's not mentioned in that incident. Her being mentioned or not being mentioned is neither here nor there. It's not an evidence either way. So in reality, if we were to take Isra and Mi'raj in the 5th year of the da'wah of the preaching, it actually solves this internal inconsistency about Surah An-Najm, and it actually makes sense from so many other perspectives. And we have two early authorities, Az-Zuhri explicitly and Ibn Abi Shayba very implicitly, very clearly saying it took place middle Makkah, not late Makkah. And to conclude then, inshallah ta'ala, before I finish off, I wanted to also mention that one of the points of Isra and Mi'raj, the fact is that, well, the date that it happened is not really that important, whether it was this day or that day. But the main point of Isra and Mi'raj, the Prophet ﷺ is being gifted a personal blessing. In the hadith in Sunan al-Tirmidhi and others, the Prophet ﷺ would make dua to Allah, Ya Allah, show me Jannah and Nar. Show me what you are telling me is true in the Quran. There's literally an explicit narration like this in our books of Sunnah. And so one night, Jibreel came and said, your Lord has responded to your dua, come with me. And so he took him to the journey of Isra and Mi'raj, which indicates Isra and Mi'raj was a personal gift to the Prophet ﷺ. And Surah An-Najm proves this point, because Allah is praising the Prophet ﷺ for having been gifted what nobody else has been gifted. And he saw what nobody saw, and his eyes did not flutter, and he did not blink, and he saw it all. And Allah Azza wa Jal blessed him to go to Sidrat al-Muntaha. All of this shows the maqam of our Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that he went even where Jibreel did not go. And it makes much more sense to me, given all these evidences, that Isra actually takes place when the persecution begins and not when it's ending in Mecca. When he needed it then, when for the very first time the Sahaba are being killed, some Sahaba have been left, have got forced to go to Abyssinia, and clearly the situation is getting very dire. Actually, even psychologically, it makes sense at that point in time for Isra to happen. In the end of the day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. It's just an academic opinion, and the main point is to benefit from the story itself and to extract fawaid. And this is just one academic detail. Wallahu ta'ala alam. Wa jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما